The ballroom glittered that night, as if the stars themselves had been trapped in chandeliers and hung low enough to blind those who dared look up the golden light, bouncing off glasses of champagne and sequined gowns, but beneath the glamour pulsed a darkness that few noticed and even fewer cared about, because in this world of wealth and power sins were not hidden. They were dressed up in velvet and jewels and paraded as entertainment, and it was into this merciless stage that Lily found herself dragged by the arm of a man she had once called father, though he had long ceased to deserve the title, her thin figure wrapped in a gown. He had forced upon her one that shimmered in the light, but felt like chains against her skin as her eyes scanned the strangers around her, men and women laughing, sipping wine, discussing fortunes, as though human suffering were a rumor from another planet. She wanted to leave, her stomach churning with dread, yet her father's grip was iron and his smile was the smile of a man playing a game he intended to win. She had grown up on the sharp edges of his addiction, watching him gamble away food, rent, and the last pieces of her childhood, until all that was left of her was resilience, a quiet strength built from surviving the storm of his choices. But tonight, she did not yet know that the storm was about to take its cruelest turn. The music paused. The crowd quieted as her father stepped into the center, raising his glass and calling for silence, his voice slick with arrogance as he announced that tonight he offered not a trinket, not art, not jewels, but something far rarer. His daughter gasps rippled through the room, at first mingled with laughter, for they thought it a joke, a tasteless attempt at humor, yet the look in his eyes was deadly serious, and the way he yanked Lily forward left no doubt about his intent. The room shifted, then predators turning their eyes on prey, assessing her beauty, her fragility, her worth. As though she were an object to be owned, she stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath shallow as she heard the first bid rise above the silence. 50,000 spoken with amusement, as though tossing a bone to a dog, her father's eyes glimmered with greed and pride swelling in his chest, as though selling his child were an achievement rather than the final act of his ruin. The bids rose, voices layered one over the other, 100,000, 150, 200, their tones casual, their smiles sharp as they fought over her like men at a market bargaining for fine silk. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed, her legs rooted to the marble floor, and in her ears the buzzing grew louder, drowning out the laughter and the music until she thought she might faint. Yet she did not collapse. She would not give them that satisfaction, though tears burned behind her eyes. She held them back, clinging to the only dignity she had left. But just as the auction neared its climax, a new voice cut through the din, deeper, steadier. Unlike the others who shouted with greed, this one spoke with finality, with authority. 3 million. The room fell silent, jaws dropping, eyes widening at the audacity of the sum whispered. Questions rippled. Who was this man who could cast such a number without blinking? All eyes turned to the back of the room, where he stood, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit cut with precision, his dark hair gleaming under the lights, his expression unreadable, but his gaze fixed unshakably on her. Lily felt it before she understood it, the weight of his eyes, not appraising, not hungry, but protective, as though he were not bidding to own her, but to shield her from those who would. And in that moment something inside her cracked, a sliver of hope, piercing through the despair. Her father's face twisted with delight, greed lighting his features as he accepted the bid. Without hesitation, the gavel fell, the deal sealed, and just like that, her fate was handed from the man who had destroyed her life to a stranger whose name she did not yet know, as murmurs swept the ballroom. The tall figure strode forward, the crowd parting instinctively before him. His steps measured his presence, commanding until he stood before her. She lifted her eyes reluctantly, bracing for another cruel smile, another arrogant leer, but instead she found eyes like storm clouds, deep and steady, holding hers. With a strange gentleness, he extended his hand, not with the entitlement of a buyer claiming property, but with the quiet respect of a man offering choice, and though every instinct screamed not to trust anyone, something about him disarmed her. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, calm. "Come with me," he said, and the sound of it resonated through her trembling bones as though anchoring her to the ground. For the first time that night, she hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her shaking fingers in his his hand warm, strong, yet not, crushing hers, guiding her from the spotlight past the sea of watching eyes and out of the prison of that glittering room into the cool night air where a sleek black limousine waited. The door opened, and she was ushered inside the leather seats. Swallowing her small frame as the door shut, muting the world outside, silence settled heavy until he finally spoke. "My name is Adrian Cole," he said, his gaze flicking to her, then back to the city lights flashing beyond the window. "CEO of Cole Enterprises. And you are safe now." She stared at him, unsure if she could believe the word safe was not something she had ever been, not with a father who gambled away. Her security not in a society that looked at her like a possession, yet the calm conviction in his tone wrapped around her like a promise stronger than any she had known. She whispered her name. Lily, her voice barely audible, and he repeated it slowly as though memorizing the sound she wanted to ask. Why he had done it. Why a man of his power and wealth would throw away millions on a girl he had never met, but her throat was too tight, and his gaze, though softened, carried a weight that silenced her. He leaned back, his expression thoughtful as though waging an internal battle. But all he said was, "You will not see him again." She turned to the window, her reflection blurred and the glass tears slipping down her cheeks unbidden. Because though she did not yet trust him, though she did not yet understand him for the first time, in years she felt the smallest flicker of safety, the smallest flicker of worth, as if perhaps her story was not ending in that ballroom. Perhaps it was only beginning. The first few mornings in Adrian's penthouse felt like waking in someone else's life to Lily, who had known only cramped rooms, peeling paint, and the sour smell of old liquor. The quiet space felt almost unreal, the floor-to-ceiling windows spilling golden light across cream walls, and the distant hum of the city below whispering that she was somewhere high above the world she had once known. She had her own room, space filled with soft blues and creams, and a bed that swallowed her small. Frame shelves lined with books she had never read, and a door with a lock she alone held the key to. A detail so simple yet so powerful, because it meant no one could storm in, no one could take from her. Without permission, she often caught herself standing there, staring at that lock as if it was a symbol of the life she had stepped into overnight. She did not understand why Adrian had done this, why he had given her a place where she was treated with dignity when so many others with his power would have done the opposite. He was gone most of the day, his time consumed by meetings and calls, but she noticed that, no matter how late he returned, there was always something small in his hand for her, a book whose worn pages hinted at a story he thought she might love, a silk scarf in a color that made her eyes look brighter, a little box of macarons from a patisserie he claimed had the best in the city. He would hand them to her without ceremony and walk away, yet she would catch the flicker of softness in his eyes before he turned, as though he was careful not to linger too long in her space. Giving her the freedom to breathe and rebuild herself slowly, she began to anticipate the evenings when they would find themselves sharing the same table, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in conversations that drifted far into the night. She told him fragments of her childhood, the pieces she could bear to remember, while he shared glimpses of his own past, the betrayals in business, the cold lessons that had shaped him into a man who trusted few and loved fewer. There was a gravity in him, a stillness that made her feel oddly safe, and yet she could sense something guarded in his gaze, as if there were corners of his soul he kept locked away. One rainy evening, the city outside blurred by streaks of water, she asked him directly why he had bid for her that night, her voice trembling, as though she was afraid of the answer. He took a long time to respond, his eyes fixed on the storm, as if searching for the right words. When he finally turned to her, his voice was low and steady. "Because I could not stand there and watch them take you," he said. "I did not know your story, but I saw it in your eyes. You were fighting to hold your ground, and I knew if I left you there, they would crush that fight until nothing was left." She felt something inside her shift at the raw honesty in his tone. Before she could speak, his phone rang, pulling him back into his world, yet his words stayed with her, echoing in the quiet long after he had left the room. It was in the small hours of the night that she began to notice a pattern. Whenever she woke from nightmares drenched in cold sweat, she would find the light in the living room still on, and Adrian there reading, as if waiting for her, He never asked what had woken her, never pressed her to speak. He would simply rise, make her a cup of tea, and sit beside her until her breathing steadied the silence between them. In those moments was not empty, but filled with something unspoken, a growing trust she had never given anyone before, and with that trust came a fear she could not ignore because it was becoming clear to her that she was falling for him, and love had never been safe in her life. Love had been a weapon used to control the wound, but with Adrian it felt different. It felt like a shelter. Her fragile peace began to crack when her father resurfaced drunk and furious, sending her messages that dripped with venom, demanding money, threatening to sell her story to the tabloids if she did not comply. The old terror returned. So fast it made her hands shake. She told Adrian everything, expecting him to be angry, but he simply listened in silence. Before calling his security chief, his voice quiet but deadly, as he instructed that her father be found warned once and only once to vanish from her life, and if he refused, the consequences would be permanent. It was then she understood that Adrian's calm could be more dangerous than rage, because he was a man who did not waste words or threats, and though his tone was cold, his eyes, when they turned to her, were warm with something fierce and unyielding. Yet the world outside his walls was not finished. Trying to wound her, whispers began to swirl among the elite about the mysterious woman living with the CEO. Some called her a gold digger, others a mistress planted to distract him from his empire. She told herself their words did not matter, but the sting of them still found its way under her skin when Adrian invited her to a charity gala. She hesitated until she learned it was being held in the very same Hamilton ballroom where they had first met. The memory of that night was a scar she carried, but she refused to let it define her. So she agreed, determined to face the place as a different woman. She walked into the gala. On his arm, wearing a gown in deep emerald that he had chosen for her, one that hugged her frame and made her eyes seem to burn under the chandeliers. This time the stares that followed them were not the hungry, calculating ones she remembered, but sharp with curiosity. Still, the evening was not free from cruelty. An older woman draped in diamonds approached her, smiling with a sweetness so thin it was almost brittle, and in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. She asked how much Adrian had paid for her. The words were like a blade slicing through Lily's composure, the air around her thick with the weight of listening ears. Before she could speak, Adrian stepped forward, his hand sliding into hers, his voice firm enough to command the room as he told them that the woman they mocked was the one he intended to marry. The room went still, shock rippling through the guests as their gazes shifted from mockery to stunned speculation. Lily's heart was a drumbeat in her chest, and for the rest of the night, she could barely focus on anything but the sound of his words replaying in her head. When they returned to the penthouse, she asked him if he had said it only too quiet. The rumors, his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath falter as he told her he had meant every word, that from the moment he had seen her across that room he had felt something he could not name at first, but it had grown with every day, until he knew it was love, real and unshakable. She felt her knees weaken at the weight of his confession, because love had always come with strings, yet his words carried none. He told her he did not care what the world thought. He cared only for her, for the way she had walked into his life with fire in her eyes, even when life had tried to break. Wide open, he asked her to marry him, not with the grandeur of public spectacle, but in the quiet of their home. The city lights sprawling beneath them like a promise, she said yes, her voice trembling but sure. Her answer, a release of years of fear and doubt. As he drew her into his arms, she realized that for the first time in her life, she belonged, not because someone had claimed her, but because someone had chosen her, not as property, but as a partner. And as the night closed around them, she knew that she had been right to walk out of that ballroom with him, because that night had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a love that would rewrite everything she had believed about herself and the world.